I am writing this because I was told to write everything down. That is what they say when they don't know what else to do with you. Write it down. Keep it factual. Keep it clean. Time, date, location. That's how reports are supposed to work. You record what happened, you submit it, and then it belongs to someone else. Evidence locker logic. Chain of custody. If it's written, it's contained. This isn't contained. I am an airport police officer. Or I was. Titles are slippery things once the clock stops agreeing with itself. But I wore the uniform. I had the badge. I knew the floor plan of Denver International Airport better than my own apartment. I knew which escalators shuttered before they failed, which doors stuck in winter, which cameras lagged by half a second, just enough to make people look like they were skipping forward in time. I trusted those details. They were real. Real things behave consistently. This did not. I'm starting at the moment I'm allowed to remember clearly. I've tried starting earlier, but the words fall apart. I'll be precise where I can. I'll avoid guessing. I won't explain what I don't understand. That's important. Explanations are where lies hide. The shift started like any other overnight. Graveyard hours, fewer flights, fewer people, more silence than an airport is supposed to have. Airports are never truly quiet. Even when they're empty, they hum. Air systems, lights buzzing. Distant machinery doing work no one sees. It's a sound you stop noticing until it's gone. I signed in at 22:43. Same pen chained to the desk. Same coffee ring on the counter. Same security supervisor complaining about the cold. Routine is a comfort. Routine tells you the world hasn't shifted while you weren't looking. I walked my usual route. Concourse B first, then C, the long way, past the closed storefronts with their metal grates pulled down like eyelids. I checked doors that didn't need checking. I looked at faces that were too tired to look back. Travelers passed through me, not around me. I was part of the furniture to them. That's how it's supposed to be. Nothing felt wrong yet. That's the part that bothers me the most now. The radio call came just after midnight. I remember because the digital clock above gate B32 had just flipped over, the numbers changing too slowly, like they were reluctant to become something else. Dispatch said there was a passenger arrival requiring assistance. Routine language, neutral, no urgency. They gave me a gate number and a flight code. Domestic, incoming. I remember pausing, because the gate was one I'd walked past not 5 minutes earlier. It had been dark. No jet bridge attached. No aircraft on the tarmac outside the window. Empty air and blinking runway lights. I asked dispatch to repeat the flight number. They did. Same number. Same gate. I said the flight hadn't landed yet. There was a pause. Not static. Just nothing. Then dispatch said, very calmly, that the passenger had already disembarked. I laughed. A short, automatic sound. Not because it was funny, but because that's what you do when something is clearly wrong, but you assume it's administrative. A typo. A miscommunication. Someone looking at the wrong screen. I said I'd check it out. On the walk back to the gate, I felt that first thin line of unease, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It's not fear. It's closer to noticing a door in your house is open when you're sure you closed it. You tell yourself there's a reason. Wind. Someone else. You don't jump to conclusions. The gate lights were on when I arrived. That was the second thing. Gates don't light themselves without instruction. The jet bridge was extended. I stood there longer than I should have, looking out through the glass. The bridge stretched into nothing. No plane. Just dark air and the reflection of the terminal behind me. My own shape superimposed over empty space. I checked the window for glare. I stepped to the side. Same view. No aircraft. Behind me I heard footsteps. I turned, already forming the words I'd say. "Sir, this area is restricted. Please remain seated." Standard script. The man walking toward me did not look lost. That struck me immediately. People who wander into wrong places at airports always look wrong. They hesitate. They look around. They clutch papers. This man walked like he was exactly where he expected to be. Middle-aged. Average height. Nothing remarkable. Carry-on bag rolling smoothly behind him. Not rushing. Not confused. He smiled at me the way people smile at uniformed authority when they want something small. Directions. Reassurance. I asked him where he came from. He said the flight. I asked him which one. He gave the same flight number dispatch had given me. I told him that flight hadn't landed yet. He frowned, just slightly, like I'd made a conversational error. Then he looked past me, toward the terminal, and said he must be late. I asked to see his boarding pass. He handed it to me without hesitation. The paper felt wrong in my hand. Not damaged. Not counterfeit. Just wrong. Too cool. As if it hadn't been warmed by a body. The ink looked faded. Not from age, but from repetition, like it had been printed. And printed again and again until the letters had grown tired. Destination, Denver. I looked at the date. It matched today. I looked at the time. It did not make sense. I told him to wait while I radioed dispatch. I remember lifting the radio. I remember pressing the button. I remember my own voice saying my call sign and asking for confirmation. What I don't remember is hearing an answer. At some point I realized the man was still smiling. I asked him if everything was all right. He said yes. He said it very clearly. Then, he asked me a question I still can't place correctly in time. He asked if this was Denver. I told him yes. He nodded, like that settled something. I looked back at the boarding pass. The letters seemed to blur for a moment. Not real. Real. Not real. That phrase came to me fully formed, like I'd been saying it for years. I handed the pass back to him. I told him to follow me. He did. As we walked away from the gate, I glanced back over my shoulder. The jet bridge was retracted. There was still no plane. I didn't report that part right away. I am reporting it now. That is where I will stop. I can feel the edges thinning if I go further. I led him away from the gate, because that is what procedure dictates when something doesn't fit. You move it out of public view. You contain it. Airports are designed around containment. Passengers are funneled, screened, delayed, redirected. Nothing is supposed to exist without a lane or a label. We walked side by side down the concourse. His suitcase wheels made no sound that I could register clearly. I noticed that only after several steps, when my own boots seemed louder than they should have been. The floor polish reflected the overhead lights in long, broken lines. I caught my reflection there, stretched and warped. I did not see his. I told myself that was just the angle. The concourse was emptier than usual. Overnight traffic had thinned to a handful of stranded travelers asleep in chairs. Jackets pulled over faces, belongings clutched like anchors. None of them looked up as we passed. Not one. That should have bothered me more than it did. At the time, I told myself people mind their own business at airports. Everyone is somewhere else in their head. We reached the secondary screening area near the end of the terminal. It's a small room. Glass walls on two sides, designed to look transparent while still feeling separate. I asked him to step inside. He did so without comment. He stood where I indicated. Hands relaxed, no tension in his posture. I asked him again where he boarded. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His brow creased. For the first time, he looked uncertain, not frightened, just delayed, like he was waiting for something to load. He gave me the name of a city. It took me a second to realize why it sounded wrong. I've worked this airport long enough to know flight routes by memory. Airlines change, schedules shift, but cities remain. This one did not. At least, not anymore. The airport there had been decommissioned years ago, converted into a logistics hub, if I remembered correctly. No passenger flights. I told him that. He smiled again, smaller this time. He said that must be outdated information. He said they took off on time. I asked how long the flight had been. He shrugged, not evasively, genuinely. He said he hadn't noticed. He said the lights had been low. I asked about turbulence. He said there was some shaking at first. Then he paused, and his eyes unfocused slightly. He said it stopped when the lights went out. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not panic. Not fear. A kind of internal distancing. Like stepping back from a ledge without realizing you were close to the edge. I asked him to wait while I checked his information. I stepped out of the room and pulled up the flight database on the nearest terminal. The system lagged. That happens. Old infrastructure. I typed the flight number carefully. I checked the airline. I checked the date. Status. In air. Altitude and speed data populated automatically. The numbers updated in real time. Cruising altitude. Normal speed. I refreshed the page. Same result. I checked arrivals. No record. Departures. Listed, but with a timestamp that did not align with the current day. I told myself the system was glitching. I'd seen worse. I opened the passenger manifest. The name was there. Spelled exactly the same as on the boarding pass. Seat number assigned. I scrolled. There were other names. A full flight. I didn't recognize any of them, which is normal. What wasn't normal was the small notation beside each entry. A code I hadn't seen before. I hovered over it. The tooltip took a moment to load. I don't remember the exact wording. I remember the impression it left. Finalized. Closed. Unrecoverable. I closed the window. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself I needed another set of eyes. I radioed for a supervisor. The radio crackled, then went quiet. Not dead. Just listening. I looked back through the glass at the man. He stood exactly where I'd left him. He was staring at the wall behind me, not at the door, not at the glass, as if something just beyond my shoulder held his attention. I re-entered the room. I asked him if he was traveling alone. He said yes. I asked if he remembered sitting next to anyone. He hesitated again. His fingers tightened on the handle of his suitcase. He said there had been people. He said it had been crowded at first. He said it got quieter. I asked him what he meant by quieter. He looked at me. Really looked this time, as if trying to decide whether I was allowed to know. Then he said people stopped talking. He said they all started listening. I asked what they were listening to. He shook his head. He said he couldn't remember. I noticed then that his boarding pass was back in his hand. I was certain I'd returned it to him earlier. I was also certain I hadn't seen him retrieve it. It was just there, folded neatly, thumb pressed against the crease. I asked him if he had any checked luggage. He said no. He said everything he needed was with him. I asked him if he had family meeting him. He said he thought so. Then he corrected himself. He said he hoped so. I asked him to take a seat. He did. The chair did not creak under his weight. I stepped out again, heart beating faster now, though I still wouldn't have called it fear. It felt procedural, like my body was preparing for paperwork. I pulled up the security camera feed for the gate. I rewound the footage. I saw myself arrive. I saw the jet bridge already extended. I saw the man walking toward me. I rewound further. The jet bridge extended on its own. I rewound further. There was no aircraft at any point. I rewound further still. The gate was dark. I fast-forwarded. The man never appeared anywhere else on camera. Not in the hallway leading from the gate. Not on the bridge. Not passing through any secured door. Only walking toward me. I checked the timestamp. It matched my memory. Mostly. I checked adjacent cameras. In one of them, for less than a second, I thought I saw another figure. Standing near a different gate. facing the jet bridge. When I adjusted the contrast, the figure was gone. I told myself I needed to log this. I opened a report template. I filled in the date and time. My hands hesitated over the incident description. What do you write when the event doesn't agree with itself? Not real. Real. Not real. I looked back at the room. The man was still seated. He had crossed his ankles. He looked comfortable, patient. He raised his head and met my eyes through the glass. He smiled again. I closed the report without saving. I told myself I would handle this informally. That was a mistake, but not for the reason you might think. I went back into the room and told him we needed to verify a few things before he could proceed. He nodded. He said he understood. Then he asked me how long it usually takes to land. I told him flights don't land inside terminals. He frowned, genuinely confused now. He said that wasn't what he meant. I asked him what he did mean. He opened his mouth to answer. That is where this part ends. The memory fractures after that. The words slip. I will continue when you tell me to. He closed his mouth without answering. Not abruptly. Slowly, like the thought had withdrawn on its own. His eyes shifted past me again, to that same point behind my shoulder, and for a moment I felt the irrational urge to turn around. I did not. I was suddenly certain that if I looked, something would be confirmed that I was not ready to hold. I asked him again what he meant. He said he wasn't sure anymore. He said it had made sense a moment ago. He apologized, the way people do when they think they're inconveniencing you. He said traveling always made his head feel strange near the end. I told him that was normal. I have said that phrase to hundreds of people over the years. It has never felt less true. I asked for identification. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a driver's license. The plastic was worn smooth at the edges. I turned it over in my hands. The photo looked like him, but not exactly. Younger maybe, or older. It was difficult to tell. The name matched the boarding pass. The address was in Denver. I felt a brief, inappropriate surge of relief at that, as if a familiar city name could anchor the rest of it. I checked the expiration date. It had passed. By a lot. I told him that. He looked genuinely surprised. He said he'd just renewed it. He said he remembered the line at the DMV, the flickering lights, the woman behind the counter chewing gum. He paused. He said the lights had flickered there too. I gave the license back. I told him to wait while I made a call. He nodded. He sat very still. His breathing was shallow, but steady. I noticed then that he did not blink very often. I stepped out of the room and walked a short distance down the corridor to where the sound carried less. I called dispatch again. This time, I got an answer. Sort of. My call sign came back to me a second later, echoed, distorted, like someone had played it through a cheap speaker in a large empty room. I asked if they had my last transmission. I asked if they could confirm the flight. There was a pause. Then dispatch said they had no record of a call from me in the last 15 minutes. I checked my watch. According to it, only 5 minutes had passed since I'd arrived at the gate. I told dispatch where I was. I told them I had a passenger claiming to have arrived on an inbound flight that was still listed as airborne. I asked them to pull the flight data on their end. They told me they didn't see any anomalies. I asked them to repeat the flight number back to me. They did. It was not the same number. I corrected them. They corrected me back. We went back and forth like that for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Each of us calm. Professional. Certain. At some point, dispatch asked me if I was feeling all right. They asked if I'd taken a break recently. They suggested I might be looking at yesterday's schedule. I told them I was looking at a man in a glass room. They asked me to describe him. I did. There was another pause. Longer this time. Dispatch asked me to confirm that I was alone. I said I was not. They asked me to look around. I did. The corridor was empty. The concourse beyond it was still. No footsteps. No voices. Just the low, ever-present hum. Dispatch said they were sending another officer to my location. I thanked them. When I returned to the room, the man was standing again. He had moved closer to the glass. He was looking at his own reflection now, studying it with a kind of quiet curiosity. I told him another officer would be joining us shortly. He nodded. He asked if that was necessary. I told him it was routine. He smiled faintly. He said everything seemed routine until it wasn't. I asked him to sit back down. He did. I asked him if he remembered the takeoff. He said yes. He described it in detail. The pressure in his chest, the angle of ascent, the way the city lights rearranged themselves beneath the clouds. His description was precise. Too precise. Like he was reciting something memorized rather than recalled. I asked him if he remembered the landing. He shook his head. He said he remembered a feeling of deceleration, but not the impact. He said it was like realizing you're already standing when you don't remember getting out of the chair. I asked him if anyone had spoken to him on the plane. He said the announcements had been difficult to understand. He said the words blurred together. He said he thought they were apologizing. For what, I asked. He thought about that. Then he said delays. I checked the clock on the wall. It showed 0017. I checked my watch again. It still showed 0005. I tapped the watch face. The second hand twitched, then froze. I asked him how long he thought he'd been traveling. He looked at the ceiling. He said time felt wrong near the end. He said the windows had gone dark. He said some people had gotten up, then sat back down again without saying anything. I asked him what he did when the lights went out. He said he closed his eyes. I asked him what he saw. He opened his mouth, then stopped. He swallowed. He said nothing. Then, quietly, he said that when he opened his eyes again, the seatbelt sign was off. He said people started standing up, but the aisles didn't feel right. He said they were longer than they should have been. I felt a tightening in my chest that I could no longer dismiss as procedural stress. I asked him why he got off the plane first. He looked genuinely confused by that question. He said he hadn't thought about it. He said the door was open. He said he heard movement behind him, but he didn't turn around. I asked him why not. He shrugged. He said he was tired. Through the glass, I saw movement at the far end of the concourse, a shape resolving into a uniform. Relief hit me hard enough that I had to steady myself. The other officer approached, younger than me. Alert, normal. He nodded at me through the glass and mouthed a question. I stepped out to meet him. I told him everything I could in as few words as possible. He listened without interrupting. He nodded in the right places. He glanced at the man through the glass. He frowned. He asked me where the passenger had come from. I told him. He asked me which flight. I told him. He checked his tablet. His brow furrowed. He said there was no arrival scheduled at that gate. I told him I knew. He said the gate hadn't been active all night. I told him I knew that too. He asked me if I'd personally seen the man exit an aircraft. I hesitated. I said I'd seen him exit the jet bridge. The younger officer looked back at the gate, visible through the concourse windows. The bridge was fully retracted now. The door sealed. He asked me where the aircraft was. I did not answer immediately. Inside the room, the man stood up again. He placed his palm flat against the glass, not pushing, just touching. He looked at both of us and said, very politely, that he didn't want to cause any trouble. He said he just wanted to go home. The younger officer asked him what city that was. The man answered without hesitation. Denver. The younger officer looked at me. Not real. Real. Not real. I realized then that the question was no longer whether the man belonged here. It was whether I did. I need to stop again. The edges are thinning more quickly now. The younger officer suggested we move the man to a holding office closer to Central Security. He said it casually, like it was the most natural step in the world. I was grateful for the suggestion. Movement felt safer than standing still. Standing still had started to feel like agreeing to something I didn't understand. The man did not resist. He gathered his suitcase and followed us without comment. As we walked, I noticed something I hadn't before. Other travelers had begun to appear in the concourse. Not many. 2 here. 1 there. Sitting upright in chairs where no one had been sleeping before. All of them quiet. All of them facing the same direction, though there was nothing obvious to look at. I pointed this out to the younger officer in a low voice. He said the overnight crowd fluctuates. He said I was probably just noticing it more because I was keyed up. I let that explanation stand. It was easier than testing it. We passed beneath a departures board. The younger officer glanced up at it, then slowed his pace. I followed his gaze. Every listed flight showed the same status. Delayed. No times. No destinations changing. Just that word, repeated line after line. He frowned and tapped his tablet again. He said his device still showed normal operations. He said the board must be glitching. We reached the holding office. It was smaller than the screening room. No glass walls, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. The younger officer asked the man to sit. He did. The door closed with a soft click. For the first time since this had begun, I felt something like containment. The room had limits. 4 walls, a ceiling, a floor. Defined space. The younger officer asked me to step outside with him. He wanted to make a call. In the hallway, he asked me directly if I was feeling well. He said it kindly. He said overnight shifts could do strange things to your head. He asked if I'd been sleeping. I told him I had. I wasn't sure that was true. He said he was going to contact operations and confirm the flight data independently. He said if there was a system issue, they'd want to know. I watched him walk away down the corridor. His footsteps sounded normal, solid, reassuring. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. When I opened them, the hallway looked slightly longer than it had before. Not stretched, just subtly rearranged, like the proportions had been adjusted by someone working from memory instead of reference. I told myself not to dwell on it. I checked the camera feed from the holding office on my tablet. The man sat exactly as I'd left him. Hands folded. Eyes closed. I watched him for a while. He did not move. The image did not stutter or lag. It was steady. Too steady. I pulled up the flight record again. This time through a different system. Same result. In air. Altitude unchanged. Speed unchanged. I scrolled down further than I had before. There were notes attached to the flight. Internal. Archived. The kind of thing you only see if you know where to look, or if the system thinks you're supposed to. The first note referenced a loss of contact. The second referenced an unsuccessful diversion. The third was blank. Below that was a timestamp that did not correspond to any calendar format I recognized. I closed the file. On the camera feed, the man opened his eyes. He looked directly at the camera. I felt a small, irrational jolt at that. People don't usually look at cameras unless they're aware of them. He smiled, faintly, and gave a small nod, as if acknowledging someone behind the lens. I adjusted the angle slightly. The camera responded with a delay. When the feed corrected itself, there were 2 people in the room. I stared at the screen. My mind searched for explanations automatically. Reflection. Artifact. Compression error. The second figure sat in the chair opposite the man. Their posture was identical. Hands folded, head slightly bowed. I checked the room number. I checked the timestamp. I checked the live indicator. The feed was live. I forced myself to look back into the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing beside me. There was no one there. When I looked back at the screen, the second chair was empty again. The man was still smiling. I felt the phrase surface again, uninvited. Not real. Real. Not real. The younger officer returned a few minutes later. He looked unsettled. He said operations had no record of any inbound irregularities. He said the flight number I'd given him didn't exist in their system. I told him it did. He said not anymore. He showed me his tablet. The flight was gone. No listing, no history, just empty search results. I pulled up my own screen. The flight was still there. We stood shoulder to shoulder, comparing displays that should have been identical. They were not. He asked me to log out and back in. I did. My screen flickered. When it returned, the flight was gone. I felt a strange sense of loss at that, as if something had been taken away before I was finished looking at it. The younger officer exhaled and rubbed his face. He said we should escort the man to medical. He said maybe he was confused, disoriented. He said there were protocols for that. I agreed. When we opened the door to the holding office, the man stood immediately, as if he'd been waiting for that exact moment. He asked if everything was sorted out. The younger officer told him we were going to take him somewhere more comfortable. The man nodded. He said he appreciated that. Then he asked a question that made my stomach tighten. He asked if the others would be coming too. The younger officer asked who he meant. The man gestured vaguely, not toward the door, but upward. He said the rest of the passengers. He said they were still waiting. I told him there were no other passengers. He frowned. He said there had been a full flight. He said they'd all stood up when the door opened. He said he'd felt them behind him. The younger officer glanced at me. I shook my head slightly. We led the man back into the concourse. The travelers in the chairs were still there, more of them now, not moving, watching. The man slowed his steps. He smiled again, wider this time. He said he was glad they'd made it. I told him they weren't with us. He looked at me with gentle confusion. He said of course they were. He said they'd been following us since the gate. I looked behind us. The concourse was empty. I did not tell him that. I am stopping here because the memory becomes less stable after this point. Details repeat. Sequences overlap. The walk toward medical took longer than it should have. Not because the distance changed, but because my awareness of it did. Every few steps, I felt the urge to count. I didn't know why. It felt important to mark progression, to prove that movement was still linear. One step, then another. I lost track almost immediately. The younger officer walked slightly ahead of us now. He kept glancing back, checking that the man was still there. Each time the man met his eyes and nodded, as if reassuring him. It occurred to me that the man never looked surprised by anything. Not by the delays, not by the questions, not by the subtle tension that had begun to coil around us. It was as though he was following a script he trusted more than we did. We passed another departures board. This one displayed arrivals. Every destination read Denver. Different flight numbers. Different airlines. Same city, repeated until it stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a word divorced from meaning. The younger officer stopped walking. He asked me if that looked right. I told him it did not. He stepped closer to the board and scrolled through the listings on his tablet. His screen showed normal data. Multiple cities. Normal arrival times. No pattern. He held the tablet up next to the board. The discrepancy was unmistakable. He laughed, once, sharply. He said this place was held together by outdated systems and bad code. He said we'd laugh about this later. The man tilted his head and studied the board. He said it looked correct to him. He said that's where they were all going. The younger officer asked him who he meant. The man said everyone. We resumed walking. The corridor toward medical narrowed slightly. Or perhaps my perception of it did. The walls felt closer. The lighting felt dimmer, though the fixtures were the same ones I'd passed under countless times before. I noticed then that my radio had gone completely silent. No static. No background chatter. Just dead weight clipped to my shoulder. I tried switching channels. Nothing. The man noticed my movement. He asked if there was a problem. I told him no. He accepted that answer easily. As we walked, he began to talk without prompting. Not rambling. Just narrating, as if continuing a conversation that had paused earlier. He said the waiting had been the hardest part. He said once the shaking stopped and the lights went out, people assumed it would be temporary. He said they stayed in their seats, because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do. You wait for instructions. He said some people got upset. He said others prayed. He said a few tried to open the overhead bins and were told not to. I asked who told them. He frowned. He said he wasn't sure. He said maybe the voice. I asked what voice. He said the one that apologized. The younger officer slowed his pace. I could tell he was listening now. Really listening, despite himself. The man said the voice kept thanking them for their patience. He said it promised they'd be arriving shortly. He said it repeated that phrase many times. Not real. Real. Not real. The words surfaced again, overlapping with the man's description, and I had to consciously push them aside to keep walking. We reached the medical wing. The door was unlocked. That should not have been the case. Overnight access is restricted. You need clearance. You need someone on duty. The lights were on inside. The reception desk was empty. The younger officer called out. No response. We stepped inside. The man took a deep breath, like someone entering a familiar space. He said it smelled right. He said it smelled like the end of a long trip. I told him to sit on one of the examination chairs. He did. The younger officer excused himself to find a medic. As soon as he was out of sight, the man's posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough to register. He leaned forward slightly, his hands unfolded. He asked me how long I'd been working here. I told him. He nodded. He said that made sense. He said people who stay too long start to blend in. He said the place gets used to them. I asked him what he meant by that. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it now. He said places like this have memories. He said they remember patterns. He said when something interrupts those patterns, the place tries to correct it. I told him he was tired. I told him confusion was normal after travel. He said he wasn't confused. He said he remembered very clearly that the plane had never landed. My chest tightened. I asked him why he'd said earlier that he thought it had. He looked genuinely apologetic. He said it was easier to say that. He said it was what I needed to hear. I asked him what he needed. He said he needed to finish arriving. I heard footsteps in the hallway and felt a surge of relief. The younger officer returned, followed by a woman in scrubs. She looked tired. Real. She greeted us normally. She asked the man his name. He told her. She wrote it down. She asked him if he was feeling disoriented. He said no. She asked him if he'd experienced any loss of consciousness. He thought about it, then said he didn't think so. She asked him to follow her to a private room. He stood. As they walked away together, I noticed something on the intake form she'd left on the desk. Under arrival method, she had written a single word. Inbound. I called out to her and asked her to wait. She turned, pen still in hand. I asked her where she thought the man had come from. She looked at me with mild confusion. She said he'd come from a flight, obviously. She said she'd seen him walk in. I asked her which flight. She paused. Her brow furrowed. She glanced down at her clipboard. She said she wasn't sure. The younger officer returned to my side. He asked me quietly if I was all right. I told him I didn't think the man should be admitted yet. I told him there were inconsistencies. He asked me to be specific. I struggled to find words that wouldn't immediately disqualify me. I gestured vaguely toward the concourse. I said the environment was off. I said systems weren't aligning. He told me I was overtired. I almost agreed with him. The man still standing near the doorway looked back at us. He said it was all right. He said he'd wait. He said they were used to waiting. I asked him who he meant again. He didn't answer. Behind him, in the hallway, I saw movement. Not the younger officer, not the medic. Figures passing by the open door, just glimpses. Shoulders. Faces turned away. More than there should have been at this hour. I asked the younger officer if he saw that. He said, "Saw what?" The man smiled again. He said softly that they were arriving. I felt the weight of the building settle around us. The hum in the walls seemed louder now, more insistent. I realized then that we had not been escorting the man through the airport. We had been following him. I cannot stabilize the sequence beyond this point without breaking it. The details loop back on themselves. Conversations repeat with slight variations. I need to stop here. I stayed behind when they took him down the hallway. I told myself it was to file a report, to make calls, to anchor something official to what was happening. In truth, I was afraid to move. Afraid that if I followed, I would cross a line I wouldn't recognize until it was too late. The younger officer hesitated at the corner and looked back at me. His expression was concerned, but still grounded in the assumption that the world behaved as it always had. I envied him that. Then he turned and disappeared from view. I was alone in the medical wing. The hum of the building was louder here. Not mechanical, exactly. Rhythmic. As if something large and patient was breathing through the walls. I became acutely aware of the space above the ceiling tiles. The maze of ducts and cables and empty corridors no one ever sees. I imagined sound traveling through them, unimpeded. I sat at the desk and stared at the intake form. The word inbound seemed darker than the others, as though it had been written with more pressure. I tried to remember seeing the medic write it. I couldn't. I tried to remember her name. That slipped away too. I pulled out my notebook, the one I kept for official notes and personal reminders. I wrote the date at the top of the page. I wrote my name beneath it. I wrote my badge number. When I looked back, the date was wrong. I crossed it out and wrote it again. It changed a second time, the numbers shifting slightly, like they couldn't decide where to settle. I closed the notebook. Not real. Real. Not real. I stood and walked to the doorway. The hallway beyond was empty now. The lights extended farther than they should have, repeating in identical intervals, the same fixture copied again and again. Perspective flattened. Distance lost meaning. I called out the younger officer's name. My voice came back to me after a delay, thinner, less certain. I took a step forward. The floor felt solid, but untrustworthy, like ice that hasn't cracked yet. I took another step, then another. Each one felt like a decision I could not undo. As I walked, I passed doorways that should have been locked. Examination rooms, storage closets, offices. Inside some of them, the lights were on. Inside others, they were dark. I did not look into any of them for long. I reached the end of the hallway and turned the corner. The concourse opened up before me. It was full, not crowded, not bustling, but occupied. Rows of people stood or sat or leaned against pillars. All of them faced the same direction, toward the gates. They were not talking. They were not moving. They were waiting. I recognized none of them individually, yet they felt familiar in the way uniforms do. Different faces, same posture. Carry-on bags at their feet, jackets folded over arms, boarding passes in hands. I walked forward slowly. No one acknowledged me. I passed between them like a current through still water. The departures boards above the gates glowed steadily. Every listing read arrived. I stopped beneath one of them and looked up. The time beside each flight was the same. A time that did not correspond to my watch, my phone, or any clock I had seen before. I felt a sudden, sharp fear that I had been late. That whatever was happening had progressed without me. I scanned the crowd for the man. I found him near the front, standing just behind the gate line. He was not alone anymore. Others stood beside him, behind him, close enough that I could feel their presence even from a distance. He turned when he sensed me watching. He smiled, but there was no relief in it now. Only recognition. He gestured toward the gate. The jet bridge was extended again. There was still no plane. I pushed my way forward, gently at first, then with growing urgency. No one resisted. They simply adjusted, making space without looking at me. Their eyes remained fixed on the open doorway at the end of the bridge. I reached the man and grabbed his arm. It felt warm, solid, real. I asked him what was happening. He said they were finishing the arrival. He said it had taken longer than expected, but delays were normal. He said the voice had promised. I asked him who the voice was. He shook his head. He said it didn't matter. He said it was part of the process. I asked him if he understood that the plane had never landed. He looked at me carefully. He said he understood that it never needed to. I asked him where the others had come from. He said from everywhere. He said some had been waiting longer than he had. He said some had arrived before the building was finished. I told him that wasn't possible. He smiled gently. He said buildings were like planes. They were only destinations if you believed in them. The jet bridge lights flickered. A murmur passed through the crowd. Not voices. Movement, a collective adjustment, like people straightening after sitting too long. I felt the airport shift around us, not physically, but conceptually, as if its purpose had been clarified. I saw the younger officer then, standing near one of the pillars. His posture mirrored the others. His radio hung limp at his side. His eyes were fixed on the gate. I called his name. He did not respond. I moved toward him, weaving through the still figures. When I reached him, I put my hand on his shoulder. He flinched slightly, as if waking from a light sleep. He looked at me with confusion. He asked me if I knew what time it was. I told him no. He nodded. He said that made sense. He said he'd been waiting for his flight to finish boarding. I asked him what flight. He gestured vaguely toward the gate. I asked him if he remembered escorting the man. He frowned. He said he remembered waiting. I asked him how long. He said he didn't know. He said time didn't behave correctly here. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I realized then that the crowd was larger than it had been moments ago. More people stood at the edges, filling in spaces that had been empty. They had not arrived through any corridor I could see. They were simply there. The man leaned closer to me. He spoke quietly, almost kindly. He said it was easier if you stopped asking questions. He said arrival was less frightening when you accepted it. I told him I was not a passenger. He nodded. He said neither had he been, at first. I looked back at the gate. The open jet bridge seemed darker now, less defined, like it led into something that did not require form. I felt the pull of it. Not physically, but psychologically. The certainty that stepping forward would resolve the tension, would answer something. Not real. Real. Not real. I stepped back instead. That choice felt important, though I did not know why. Stepping back did not create distance the way I expected it to. The space between me and the gate remained the same, measured not in feet but in intention. I felt it resist me, like moving against a slow current. No one noticed my retreat. No heads turned. No murmurs followed. The crowd continued its patient stillness, unified by something I was no longer certain I was outside of. I searched for an exit. Not a door, not a corridor, but a way out that still belonged to the version of the airport I understood. Every terminal has them. Service hallways, emergency stairwells, the forgotten arteries that keep the place alive without being seen. I knew where they were supposed to be. I could not see any of them. The concourse extended in both directions, identical in either direction. Repeating gates, repeating signs, repeating benches occupied by the same posture in different bodies. I walked toward what should have been the entrance to a maintenance corridor near gate C18. It was not there. In its place was another gate, another jet bridge, another open doorway into nothing. I felt the beginnings of panic then, real panic, sharp and unprofessional. My breathing quickened. My thoughts began to overlap. I forced myself to slow down. Panic feeds on momentum. That was something they taught us early on. I told myself to think like an officer, secure the situation, identify variable, establish control. The man's words echoed back to me. You weren't a passenger at first. I tried to remember the start of my shift, the act of signing in, the feel of the pen, the complaint about the cold. Those memories were still there, but they had lost weight, like photographs you've looked at too many times. I looked down at my uniform. The fabric felt thinner than it should have. The badge on my chest reflected the overhead lights poorly, as if its surface had dulled. I noticed then that some of the people in the crowd were wearing uniforms too, not just airline staff. Security, ground crew, faces I almost recognized, people who should have been working, not waiting. I approached a woman in a reflective vest. She stood near a gate, hands clasped in front of her, eyes fixed ahead. I said her name. I was fairly sure it was her name. She did not respond. I said it again, louder. She blinked, once, slowly. Then, she looked at me. Her eyes held the same calm confusion I'd seen in the man earlier. She asked me if boarding had started. I told her no. She frowned, then relaxed. She said that was all right. She said she could wait. I asked her how long she'd been here. She thought about it, then said she wasn't sure. She said the shift had started, but it hadn't ended yet. She said that happened sometimes. I asked her if she remembered arriving. She smiled faintly. She said everyone arrives eventually. I left her there. The crowd seemed closer now, not physically, but attentively. I felt observed without seeing eyes turned toward me. The sense of being evaluated by something diffuse and collective. The man appeared at my side without my noticing his approach. He said I was making it harder than it needed to be. I asked him why he was doing this. He looked genuinely puzzled by the question. He said he wasn't doing anything. He said he had gotten off the plane. He said the rest followed. I asked him what happened to the flight. He said it was still in the air. I asked him how that was possible. He said it wasn't. He said that was the problem. He said the plane could not finish what it had started. He said that tension had to resolve somewhere. I told him this was an airport, not a solution. He smiled. He said airports were nothing but solutions. He said they existed to process people from one state to another. I asked him what state this was. He did not answer. The departures board above us flickered. The word arrived, vanished. In its place appeared another word. Processing. I felt something tighten around that word, like a concept locking into place. The man gestured toward the gate again. He said they needed someone to stand there, someone to make it official. I asked him what he meant. He said arrivals required witnesses. He said authority mattered. He said uniforms made things real. I told him no. He looked at me with something like sympathy. He said that didn't change the requirement. I saw it then, with sudden clarity. The way the crowd subtly oriented itself toward me. The way the gate closest to us seemed more defined than the others. The way the jet bridge lights pulsed faintly, as if responding to proximity. I backed away again. The man did not follow. I felt the pull grow stronger, a pressure behind my eyes, a suggestion rather than a force. The certainty that if I stepped into the role being offered, the discomfort would ease. The waiting would end. Not real. Real. Not real. I repeated the phrase under my breath like a tether. I thought of the younger officer, of the medic, of the woman in the reflective vest, of the countless others whose faces I couldn't place but whose posture I recognized. How many of them had resisted? How many had eventually stepped forward, just to make it stop? I realized then that I had not seen a single person leave. I turned and walked, not toward an exit, but away from the gates entirely. Toward the administrative offices, toward the back hallways, toward places defined by purpose other than arrival. The space resisted me again, but less so this time. I felt the attention of the crowd waver, like something losing interest. I found a door that shouldn't have been unlocked. I went through it and closed it behind me. The hallway beyond was narrow and dim. The air felt stale, unused. I leaned against the wall and breathed until the shaking subsided. I do not know how long I stayed there. Eventually, the hum of the building softened. The pressure receded. I found my way back to a version of the airport that made more sense. Not fully. Never fully. But enough. They told me later that I had been found sitting near a closed gate, unresponsive. That there had been no passenger, that no flights had arrived at that time, that I had been alone. They asked me to write it all down. I am doing that now. What I have not told them is this. Sometimes, when the terminal is quiet enough, I hear movement near the gates. Not footsteps. Not voices. Just the sound of waiting being adjusted. Sometimes, the departures boards flicker. Sometimes I find the word inbound written where it shouldn't be. I am not sure if I stepped far enough away. I am not sure if the arrival finished without me. I am not sure if writing this is a report or a boarding pass. I don't know when this became a record instead of a report. The distinction mattered at first. Reports are meant to be reviewed. Records are meant to survive. I stopped checking the date after it changed 3 times in one paragraph. I stopped signing my name when it began to look unfamiliar, like a word I'd repeated too often. They moved me off overnight shifts. They said it was temporary. They said it was for my own good. Daytime makes things easier to explain. Light fills in gaps whether it belongs there or not. The airport looks almost ordinary when it's busy. People move with purpose. Arrivals and departures blur into something that resembles progress. Almost. I still avoid the gates when I can. I take longer routes. I use staff corridors that smell like dust and old paint. I keep my head down when I pass the departure boards. Most of the time, they behave. Cities I recognize. Times that move forward. Most of the time, there are gaps in my memory now that don't feel like forgetting. They feel like edits. As if something has gone back and removed moments that were never meant to be reviewed. I'll find myself standing somewhere without recalling how I got there. I'll hear my call sign spoken in a voice that sounds like mine, but isn't. When I ask coworkers about certain nights, they smile politely. They say I wasn't scheduled. They say I must be thinking of a different shift. They don't lie exactly. They just don't remember what I remember. I still see the man sometimes. Not clearly. Not directly. He appears in reflections. In the polished floor near closed gates. In the darkened glass of jet bridges that aren't in use. He never looks at me anymore. He stands, among others now. Blended in. Patient. Sometimes I think I recognize faces in the crowd that aren't there. A medic. A younger officer. A woman in a reflective vest. Their uniforms change. Their posture does not. Once, I found a boarding pass in my locker. No name. No seat number. Just a destination. Denver. I threw it away. It was back the next day. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase has worn a groove in my thoughts. I don't know which part of it I believe anymore. I only know that repetition makes things feel truer, even when they aren't. There are nights when the airport hum deepens, drops into a lower register. On those nights, the gates feel closer together. The jet bridges extend further than they should. I swear I can hear a voice beneath the announcements, thanking someone for their patience. I never stay to listen. This account ends here because it has to. Because records need edges, even when the events don't. I have left gaps on purpose. I have avoided certain details. I don't want this to become complete. Completion feels dangerous. If someone finds this, if you are reading it somewhere quiet, I need you to pay attention the next time you are in an airport late at night. Watch the people who stand without looking at their phones. Listen for announcements that don't quite make sense. Notice which gates are lit when no planes are visible. If you ever see a jet bridge extended into empty air, do not assume it is a mistake. Do not assume the flight is late. And if someone in a uniform asks you to follow them, look at their badge. Look at their hands. Look at their eyes. Ask them how long they've been waiting, because arrivals do not always end. And sometimes, the airport remembers you before you remember yourself. I need to stop now. The terminal is quieter than it should be, and I can feel something shifting, like a door, being prepared. I am not certain this is finished. I am not certain it ever will be.